Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. An armistice agreement more than 60 years ago brought an end to the fighting on the Korean Peninsula, but not the hostilities. And while the last few months have been eventful, they have gone without provocation. What then do the next few months have in store? On today's After 10, we take a look at the current state of affairs on the peninsula with Bruce Klingner of the Heritage Foundation.
The Korea-U.S. Foreign Ministers meeting as well as the Vice Foreign Ministers meeting were held at the beginning of the new year. And the situation of North Korea has been one of the main agenda items of the high-level talks between the two nations. The North has adopted appeasement policies, making a specific proposal to suspend mutual slander. But the Park Geun-hye government has promoted its diplomatic principle, stressing the need to strengthen the security precautions against the North's provocations. What would be the risk factors surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and what kind of cooperative measures should be taken by Korea and the United States? We discuss ways to navigate through the challenges with an expert on the Korean Peninsula.
Mr. Klingner, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with the North's recent proposal to end slanderous comments and to end hostilities with the South starting January 30th, an offer the South, we should note, dismissed as being illogical and insincere. Your initial response to that proposal was what?
Well, when North Korea says we should stop slandering each other, really the only Korea that's slandering the other is North Korea. And obviously the only Korea that's doing provocations or attacks on the other is North Korea. So it's really obviously a propaganda ploy.
Propaganda, insincere, as the South Korean government put it as well. The motive here, as you mentioned there, propaganda. What were they really trying to do with the proposal?
I think it's trying to appeal to either people in South Korea, the government, or outside who would bring pressure on the government to try to return to talks or even negotiations with the North. It's trying to portray North Korea as either the aggrieved partner or at least the responsible party, trying to put the onus for the stalemate in inter-Korean relations on the South Korean government.
And the North had to expect that the South was going to reject this offer. Not a surprise that they did, of course. The question, I guess, being, did the South even have it? Was there a conversation about this decision? Was there even a choice there to reject it or accept it?
Well, I don't think South Korea really rejected it out of hand. Park Geun-hye responded with sort of a reiteration of the let's have a reunion of the separated families as really was required by the 2000 summit inter-Korean agreement. So I think she responded saying that this is something that North Korea has agreed to many, many times and yet has never fulfilled really its promise on the separated family reunion.
And this proposal and subsequent rejection are adding some fuel to the speculation that we may see a provocation from the North in the coming weeks or months. Are you of the same mindset that one is coming?
I think asking will North Korea do a provocation is like asking will it rain. Of course, it's in the nature of the regime, and they do it when they feel it'll achieve their objectives. It's just the timing, and that's always the more difficult thing to predict.
And in terms of timing, when do you think we might see a provocation, and in what form might it take?
Well, certainly last year, March and April, not only was the timing during the annual U.S.-South Korean military exercises, but also, I think more importantly, was when the UN was deliberating additional sanctions after North Korea's nuclear test. North Korea abrogated the armistice again, threatened war against the U.S. and its allies, did a number of things to try to intimidate not only the UN Security Council, but I think really particularly China, to get China to continue to act like Pyongyang's lawyer in the Security Council, to try to minimize the international efforts to impose sanctions on North Korea for yet another violation of the UN Security Council resolutions.
Nuclear test, missile test, something like we saw on Yeonpyeong Island. What form do you think the provocation might take?
Unfortunately, the uncertainty adds to the nervousness and adds to the danger. North Korea has a broad spectrum of military threats. We've seen the conventional threat, obviously, is very real, as seen in Cheonan and Yangpyeong-do attacks. Last year in April, we saw very high tensions, dangerously high tensions, brought on by Kim Jong-un. There wasn't concern in Washington that there would be a strategic attack, a nuclear attack, either on Seoul or Washington. There was great concern, though, about another tactical attack, perhaps against Pyongyang Island. North Korea was very specific in the threats against the 6th Marine Brigade of South Korea. Kim Jong-un moved long-range artillery assets closer to the island. He even visited the northern islands just across the water there, and telling the troops, I want to see the 6th Marine Brigade in flames and send the photos to Central Command. There was the concern that there would be a tactical clash. And North Korea may have felt emboldened that the U.S. and South Korea have never responded to previous attacks. But I think the situation has changed after Yangpyeong-do. South Korea would be far more likely to respond militarily, and Kim Jong-un may not realize that.
So greater chance then for a misstep or miscalculation in all of this?
I think so, and certainly there may be another nuclear test, not only as a provocation, as a signal, but really as almost a proof of concept, a continuing development of the nuclear programs. And what there is concern about another nuclear test, not only because it would raise tensions and lead to a response by the UN, which then could lead to a North Korean military response, but if this time it's detected that it's a uranium-based weapon, that would show that North Korea has developed a viable parallel, a second path to nuclear weapons. So far, their arsenal is only based on plutonium. And that program is largely capped. They haven't been reprocessing, they haven't been having fuel go through the reactor at Yongbyon. Uranium is a far different story. We know very little about how large the program is. We know they have thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of centrifuges. If we detect that it's a uranium-based test, that shows that there's a whole other way that they could augment their nuclear weapons arsenal.
And in terms of what we've seen from Pyongyang over the last few months, especially with the ouster and execution of Jang Song-taek, how does that play into this possibility here that we're going to see a provocation in the coming months?
There's a lot of concern generated by the Jang Song-taek purge and execution. It's very unusual. Normally, if even an innermost circle member is eliminated, usually it was done quietly in the past. Now it's obviously very public, and we're uncertain why Kim Jong-un is doing that. It seems that he's maintaining the policies of his father and his grandfather. He's certainly not the reformer that some people predicted when he first came into power. But he's maintaining these policies, but in a more brutal fashion, a more volatile, a more unpredictable way. And that just generates even more concern in Washington. We can debate amongst experts whether this shows a strong or a weak Kim Jong-un, whether it's more or less stability. Some feels it's greater instability, which would add yet more concerns, more dangers. I think actually it shows a more stable Kim Jong-un regime. I think he's consolidated his power, he's strong enough, he's confident enough to go against even the second most powerful man in Korea. But a stable North Korea doesn't mean a non-dangerous or a non-threatening North Korea. Kim Jong-un has shown he's a dangerous threat, a brutal threat, not only to the populace of North Korea, but to the neighbors.
You talked a little bit about the leader we believe to know, that is Kim Jong-un right now. What have we learned over the past couple of years under his leadership about him and his leadership style?
Well, the fact that we know less about him than his father is yet another area of concern. We don't feel that we know, does he understand the concept of red lines? Would he stumble across a red line and do something that his father would have known to stop short of? Would he realize that that under Park Geun-hye, that South Korea will more likely retaliate to another Yangpyeong-do-like attack, not only because of her public statements, but changes in the rules of engagement, which were actually implemented by Lee Myung-bak, pushing the decision to retaliate to a lower command echelon. That's very different from the past. Kim Jong-un may not realize that. But I think what we've seen is the policies are the same, but we think he's more unpredictable, and he seems less adept at foreign policy than his father.
The age maybe being a factor in that? I assume?
Age and experience, but he doesn't seem to have a grasp of foreign policy like his father. Certainly Kim Jong-il did provocations and attacks. He was behind a number of the terrorist attacks conducted by North Korea. But it seemed like they were done to achieve an objective. With Kim Jong-un, we don't get that same sense. For one thing is, Kim Jong-il, when he raised tensions, he would do it incrementally. And it was a way of having the U.S. or South Korea offer concessions, offer benefits to try to buy our way back to the status quo. Kim Jong-un, we saw last year, did provocations in a very rapid fashion, which didn't allow anyone the opportunity, had they been inclined, to offer concessions, to allow North Korea to achieve some kind of objective. So we have much greater uncertainty about what he will do.
Let's look ahead to next month, the end of next month. The U.S. and South Korea are apparently going to go ahead with these joint military drills that are annual exercises. The North, year in and year out, speaks out against them, asks for them to be canceled, and offers threats in exchange for them not being called off. Give us a better sense, if you would, about how the North views these exercises specifically.
Well, they always portray them as a precursor to an invasion. And that way it puts the onus on the United States and South Korea as being the warmongers, as being the belligerents, as being the real threat to the Korean Peninsula. And then if, as always, that doesn't lead to an invasion, then they can claim victory, that the stalwart North Korean military forces defeated the imperialist U.S. and its puppet in South Korea against an invasion. But I think a couple points sort of outside of the usual conversation are important to note is, one, when the U.S. and South Korea canceled Team Spirit exercises back in the early 1990s as a way of inducing North Korea not to pursue a nuclear weapons program, it didn't have any effect. We offered a significant concession and North Korea continued with its nuclear programs. Another factor is that every year North Korea does its own military exercises. And yet the U.S. and South Korea don't really make that publicly known. They have a winter training cycle. It starts in December. It increases in echelon and usually culminates in March or April with a core level, usually a mechanized core exercise, sometimes the core moving close to the demilitarized zone. I think that's something the U.S. and South Korea should highlight as military exercises that are provocative. They move close to the DMZ. And yet we sort of lose an opportunity to educate the public that these things are going on in North Korea, and North Korea always just makes it seem like we're the only ones doing military exercises.
In looking at the current state of things here, there are very real concerns about what the North is doing or what they might do. The U.S., in the midst of all that, seems to be increasing its military might here on the peninsula. They're bringing 800 additional troops in for what they're calling a standard deployment. Again, increasing the military might here. What are we to read into that? Why the increased military presence or focus here in Korea?
There are a number of things going on. Some is just, it is a pre-exercise deployment. Bringing some forces in that will be participating in these exercises. A second factor is when we talk about an increase in forces, that may not necessarily be correct if you think in terms of a number of the units were removed from the peninsula for service in Iraq and Afghanistan. So not only on the peninsula but throughout the Pacific, some forces are going back to their original garrisons. So you could see it as an increase, but really it's a return to the level that there was before. And also, despite a lot of the very strong rhetoric from the Obama administration over its Asia pivot, the reality is that there's more bark than bite there. Under the Asia pivot, despite the perceptions, there are no new permanent deployments that are part of that strategy. They are rotational. Not only the large military, the Marine Darwin Initiative, that's rotational, and it's really a resumption of a program that was done before 9/11. Even the forces coming in Korea are largely rotational. And as we underfund our defense budget, we're seeing that it's having a great impact on the U.S. military. 1 in 3 Air Force planes worldwide are now grounded because of lack of funding. Several ships in the Pacific theater aren't leaving port for training or deployments because of a lack of funding.
Is this any indication, though, the increased military presence here, that there is maybe a bigger concern about Kim Jong-un than we might know?
Right. Whether they're rotational, as they are, there is greater concern in Washington, not only because of the uncertainty following Chung Sung-tek's execution, but really since Kim Jong-un came into office. As I said, the dangerously high level of tensions last March and April had a lot of uncertainty. So we sent a number of signals to show resolve for defending our South Korean ally. We sent B-52s and B-1s and B-2s through the region to try to send a signal of resolve. Unfortunately, we kind of undercut our signal when Secretary Kerry the next day said the U.S. has lowered its rhetoric, has canceled several military exercises. So unfortunately, the administration was sending some conflicting signals, and I think that undermined the signal of resolve for defending South Korea.
And in terms of looking at the possibility of a regime change or a shift in the structure there, I believe you're of the thought that Kim Jong-un isn't going anywhere for a while, right?
I don't think so. I think we've seen that he if nothing else, he's the leader today. And I think sometimes we can do what I'd call paralysis by analysis. Sometimes we overinterpret what would be called the criminology of North Korea, which second most powerful person is ascendant today or not. It's, sort of a never-ending quest to find a reformer in North Korea, and the idea that if we can find someone, then they would be more moderate in their behavior. We can debate amongst experts, as we always do, whether Kim Jong-un is strong or weak, whether things are stable or not stable. In a way, we need to just take a step back and say, he is the leader today. These are his actions, these are his policies, and we need to respond accordingly. We need to make our own policies in response to what his actions and his words have been, which I think are largely consistent with what his father and his grandfather have done.
We've seen a real push in the last several months for a resumption of the six-party talks. There seemed to be some momentum behind that. I don't believe, though, you are someone who thinks the six-party talks are necessarily a good idea at this point. Why is that?
Well, right now, the Obama administration has made very clear, and it's a view shared by our South Korean and Japanese allies, that there really is no utility to going back to formal negotiations. The six-party talks, the sole purpose or the principal purpose is to achieve denuclearization of North Korea. As long as Pyongyang says at a very authoritative level, including changing their constitution to make themselves a nuclear state, as long as Pyongyang says we'll never, ever, ever give up our nuclear weapons, it is a fool's dream, in their words, to believe we will trade our nuclear weapons for petty cash. There seems to be little utility in resuming formal negotiations. We can have bilateral meetings or multilateral meetings, but the Obama administration feels it has reached out in 2009, and North Korea showed it would act just as badly to him as to George Bush, and they tried the Leap Day Agreement of February 2012. That collapsed within 2 weeks, given North Korea's announcement it would violate the UN Security Council resolutions yet again with a missile launch. So the administration doesn't feel an inclination to go back to talks. They don't feel that it would be successful. And I think right now we're looking to South Korea to perhaps take the lead. There's a great deal of confidence and respect for President Park Geun-hye in Washington. They feel, both in and outside of the U.S. government, that her trust politique policy is a principled one, it's a pragmatic one. It is a proper mixture of incentives and outreach with defensive and deterrent measures. But as President Park has said, it takes two hands to clap, and unfortunately, the landscape is littered with the shattered dreams of hope for engaging North Korea.
You talk about this trust-building process. What is your personal view of it? Do you think it's the right route to take?
I think it is. I think really there's a more continuity between it and Lee Myung-bak's policy than perhaps President Park's administration would like to admit. I thought his policy also was a mixture of outreach. He had a long list of incentives he was willing to offer North Korea. Despite the perception or the depiction of it as a hardline policy, his only demand was that North Korea start to live by its many, many signatures on its many international agreements. hardly, hardline or unreasonable to me. I think President Park Geun-hye is doing that kind of policy, I think more effectively though. I think she has a more adept public diplomacy aspect to it. She's pointing out that, she has tried to move forward on the Kaesong joint zone. She's looking for reunion, the separated families before moving on to Kumgangsan. She's offered a number of benefits, but again, North Korea has firmly rejected it. And even on the eve of her inauguration, when North Korea did a nuclear test, that was not an encouraging signal.
You spoke earlier about the possibility of there being bilateral or even trilateral talks with the North. I guess the question is, how do we get to that point, and what would the ultimate goal of those talks be?
Well, the goal of sort of diplomatic meetings, absent formal six-party talks, negotiations, would be hopefully to hear North Korea say, we will begin to abide by our many pledges to denuclearize. We will begin to abide by the will of the international community, which is dictated through numerous UN resolutions, that North Korea shall abandon its nuclear weapons and the missile means to deliver them. In the meantime, though, we need the current as well as additional punitive measures, targeted financial measures, sanctions, to try to change North Korea's calculus, to try to get them to realize the very stark choice between the consequences of their current policy and the benefits that they could accrue if they were to begin to abide by the pledges that they made before.
Amid all the uncertainties surrounding North Korea and the possibilities as well of there being a provocation from Pyongyang, what types of cooperative measures are needed between Washington and Seoul in particular?
Well, we have actually a very, very close relationship. As I mentioned, there's a great deal of respect for President Park Geun-hye in Washington. She has a long history of supporting the alliance, of supporting the partnership between Washington and Seoul. So there's no concern if she reaches out to Pyongyang, if she reaches out to Beijing. We're hopeful that will bring success. We have a very strong relationship on the six-party talks as well as on the alliance issues. So in working with the two of us as well as in concert with Japan, we're hoping to convince Russia and China to put more pressure on North Korea to comply with their requirements to denuclearize. There's not a lot of hope anymore that Xi Jinping will be any different in his policies. About a year ago, there was hope that China had become so angry at its irksome ally that it was going to put more pressure. It was going to actually abide by the sanctions implementation. But unfortunately, the last year we've seen less progress with China than we had hoped.
There's certainly never any easy answers when it comes to North Korea. Bruce Klingner, thank you very much, though, for coming by and providing your insights today. We appreciate it. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.